When did you realize your girlfriend's allergies were actually fake? Before we begin, if you enjoy unsettling true-style stories that peel back the layers of what people hide, make sure to subscribe to Tale Hub. Your support helps these stories come alive. I realized something was wrong with my girlfriend long before I admitted it to myself. Not because of anything dramatic, not because of any visible danger, but because fear itself had begun to feel rehearsed. If you've ever watched someone pretend to be fragile, you know there's a moment when the act cracks, just for a second. A breath too steady, a reaction a little too delayed. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. This story begins with a woman who carried an EpiPen everywhere, whose life was supposedly shaped by deadly allergies, and with the night I first noticed that none of it made sense. I used to tell people that loving Natalie required patience, but in truth it required something closer to endurance. From the outside, she looked fragile in a way that invited protection's soft features, careful movements, the kind of person who would flinch at a loud noise or double-check a locked door. Her entire life revolved around the idea that the world was full of danger, threats, and hidden traps that only she could sense. And for a long time, I believed her. She spoke often about her allergies, about how the world around her was littered with invisible hazards. Every surface, every plate, every restaurant became a battlefield she had to navigate. People admired her vigilance. They pitied her, supported her, accommodated her. I did too, at first. I told myself it wasn't her fault. She didn't ask to be this sensitive, this vulnerable. I convinced myself that patience was the least I could offer, but patience slowly turned into confusion, then suspicion, and finally, a quiet dread that settled in the back of my mind because none of her symptoms ever added up. Her routine became so predictable it almost felt choreographed. Every restaurant visit began with inspection, tension, and the same tight expression spreading across her face as she scanned the menu like a bomb technician assessing wires. Servers would grow increasingly nervous, stumbling through ingredient lists and preparation details under her stern gaze. People around us shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward other tables, clearly wishing the ordeal would end. I always apologized, bending over backwards to soften the discomfort she created. For 2 long years, I dismissed the warning signs. I brushed off inconsistencies, explained away odd moments, made excuses for her. I believed love meant defending someone, even when something inside you whispered that the story didn't hold together. But doubt has a way of growing in silence. And with Natalie, the silence became heavy. There was never swelling, never redness, never the rapid shift in breathing she often claimed. She described sensations no one could see, tightness in her throat, burning on her tongue, dizziness that vanished the second we left a restaurant. She would sit dramatically still, one hand pressed to her chest, forcing frantic breaths. But the more I observed, the more her patterns repeated in the exact same way every time. Nothing changed, no matter the food, the setting, the risk level. Her symptoms began with the same expression and ended the same way, with control regained, attention received, and the environment rearranged around her supposed fragility. It became impossible to ignore how the world bent itself to her comfort, while she offered nothing in return. My family stopped inviting us to dinners because she claimed their kitchens were contaminated. My friends stopped hosting gatherings because she insisted their snacks were dangerous. My sister banned nuts, seafood, and dairy from her home for a single evening, then received a harsh lecture for accidentally leaving a container of yogurt on the counter. Natalie never took responsibility, only space. Her allergies weren't a burden to her. They were a burden she placed on everyone else. I didn't want to see the truth for a long time. Love can do that. It can make reality blurry, bend your judgment, make lies seem sentimental instead of manipulative. I preferred to believe I was helping her, that I was supporting a woman who needed protection. But deep down, something inside me knew that the emergency was never real. And the realization began one quiet evening in her apartment. We were packing boxes because Natalie had decided she needed a more controlled environment. Her words always had a way of framing her desires as necessities. She claimed the ventilation system in her building mixed allergens from neighboring units into her space. In her mind, she lived surrounded by invisible threats no one else could detect. I believed her because it felt cruel not to. But standing in her hallway that day, something about her behavior felt off. Her voice called out from the kitchen, asking me to find packing tape. But when I opened the wrong drawer, what I found didn't match any version of reality she had presented to me. The drawer was stuffed with takeout containers food she swore she could never eat. Heavy sauces, crumpled wrappers, and oily boxes lined the space like quiet ghosts of every lie she had told. The sight hit me hard, not just because of the food itself, but because of how fresh the containers looked. Some receipts were barely a day old. It was the first physical proof that something about her story didn't fit. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she ate with medications. Maybe someone else left them there. But the deeper I dug, the more impossible it became to justify. Every container contradicted her claims. Every sauce contradicted her fears. Every bite she supposedly could never take was there, stacked neatly in secret. Discovery didn't make me angry, it made me feel sick. Because deception this deep wasn't impulsive, it was habitual. I tried to tell myself not to overreact, to confront her calmly, to listen. But my instincts wouldn't quiet down. I needed more than one drawer to understand what was going on. And when I followed her that night, my suspicion turned into something undeniable. Watching her walk into a seafood restaurant, the same one she had once called a death trap, felt surreal. It was as though the world around her had suddenly been rearranged, not by allergies, but by her narrative. When she ordered shrimp and ate it without so much as a flinch, my stomach turned. Not because of the shrimp, but because of every moment she had used fear to control situations, every person she had guilted into accommodating her, every tear she had shed when she claimed she was dying. She was living a double life, one where the truth hid behind closed drawers and late-night meals, a life where fragility was a weapon she wielded without hesitation. And once the truth revealed itself, I couldn't ignore it. I went back to her apartment with shaking hands. Her drawer held more than food. Beneath the containers, I uncovered the allergy test results. Line after line of negative markers, a doctor's note suggesting psychological evaluation rather than dietary restrictions. She had never followed the doctor's advice. She had never mentioned the results. She had chosen the lie instead. Everything suddenly clicked into place. Her panic attacks at restaurants, her dramatic reactions, her demands, her manipulations, the way she needed the world to revolve around her fragility. Her allergies weren't real. Her need to be the center of attention was. In that moment, anger didn't come. Instead, a heavy grief settled in my chest. Not grief for her, but for the version of myself who had spent years supporting someone who misused vulnerability as a tool. I knew I couldn't confront her alone or quietly. Too many people had been affected by her lies. Too many had walked on eggshells, altered their lives, and lived in fear of triggering reactions that never existed. The truth needed a stage. Her birthday party became the stage. I thought about everything she'd done, every demand she'd made, every moment she'd wrapped people around her narrative. I thought about how she would stand at the center of every event, how conversations always revolved around her limitations, her restrictions, her fears, how she basked in pity like it was applause. Her party was the perfect moment to reveal what she had hidden, not out of cruelty, but because deception of this magnitude was a web she had spun around everyone she knew. It was time to cut through it. The preparations were simple. I baked cookies with nothing but sugar, flour, and butter. Simple ingredients, safe ingredients. Ingredients she claimed were forbidden, but happily ate without knowing. I watched her enjoy them, laughing and mingling, unaware of the truth unraveling around her. When I stepped into the center of the room and asked everyone for their attention, it felt like stepping into a different life, a life where I no longer carried her burdens, a life where I chose honesty over manufactured fear. And when I revealed the truth, the facade she had built for years fractured in a single instant. That moment marked the beginning of the end, but it was not yet the end, because the aftermath of a long-standing lie doesn't unfold in a single scene. It echoes, expands, and reveals even more than you expected. And the fallout of Natalie's deception was far from over. The moment the room fell silent after the reveal, it felt as though the air had thickened. People who had once bent over backward to protect Natalie now stood frozen, unsure if they were witnessing a cruel joke or the collapse of a long-held illusion. The atmosphere changed in a way I'll never forget, an uneasy blend of disbelief, shock, and dawning clarity that spread across every face present. Natalie wasn't used to silence. She thrived on attention, on the world orbiting around her imagined fragility. Being confronted in front of an audience stripped her of the control she relied on so heavily, and for the first time since I'd met her, she looked small, not fragile, not sick, just small. Her facade didn't crumble in dramatic fashion. Instead, it cracked quietly. There was no collapse, no panicked breath, no downward spiral. She simply stood there, stiff and trembling, as though trying to hold together a mask that no longer fit her face. Everyone in the room had been manipulated in some way. Every guest carried a memory of accommodating her demands, canceled dinners, altered menus, grocery lists rewritten to fit her narrative. Some had felt guilty for not doing enough. Others had felt frustrated but remained polite. Many had pitied her. Now they all stared at a woman who had taken their empathy and twisted it into a stage for her insecurities. People began to shift. Soft murmurs rippled across the room. No one approached her. No one comforted her. They watched, waiting for an explanation she was unable to give. She attempted a few shaky breaths, perhaps hoping to revive her old tricks. But without an audience willing to believe her fear, her performance fell flat. For years, she had relied on the threat of danger to command space in every environment. But in this moment, the danger was gone. And so was her power. I turned and walked away, not out of anger, but out of relief. Relief that the truth no longer had to exist in the shadows of secrecy and suspicion. Relief that I could finally stop carrying a responsibility that had never been mine. Half the room followed me. The separation was instinctual, an unconscious acknowledgement of who had been misled and who had done the misleading. Behind us, Natalie remained frozen, a statue caught between denial and exposure. Some guests lingered, friends of hers, people who didn't yet understand what they had witnessed or who refused to believe it. But most had seen the truth written plainly in her reaction, the abrupt end to her performance, the lack of any real physical response, the emptiness in her expression when confronted with undeniable evidence. When we left the house, the night air felt lighter than it had in months, perhaps years. But the end of the party wasn't the end of the story. The next morning, my phone vibrated with messages. Some were from people who had attended the party, expressing shock or gratitude. Others were from family members who wanted to talk. A few were from friends trying to wrap their minds around Natalie's lies. Her narrative had woven itself so deeply into our collective routines that its unraveling felt like waking from a dream, one you didn't realize you were trapped in until someone else opened the door. But Natalie didn't disappear. People like her rarely do. Instead, she attempted damage control the only way she knew how, by rewriting the story. By noon, she had posted online about how she had been emotionally ambushed. She framed the incident as an attack, a cruel setup orchestrated by someone who never cared about her well-being. She painted herself as a victim whose sensitivities had been exploited for entertainment. Her followers, those who didn't know her personally, rallied around her. Sympathy poured in from strangers, people drawn to her dramatic language and her fragile presentation. She fed off it. The cycle repeated. But those who knew her, the people at the party, her family, my family, those who had witnessed countless moments of confusion, frustration, and accommodation, weren't so easily swayed. For them, the truth had finally taken shape. They had seen what I had ignored for far too long, a pattern of manipulation tightly wrapped in faux vulnerability. Her mother called me later that evening. The conversation was calm, almost eerily so. She apologized, not for Natalie's behavior, but for the years of enabling that had led to it. She admitted that Natalie had always leaned toward dramatization, always found comfort in attention, always preferred being the sick one, the delicate one, the one who required careful handling. It wasn't malicious, she said. It was habitual, learned, reinforced. I didn't argue, I didn't hold resentment. Instead, I felt an odd sense of closure, not happiness, not triumph, just closure. But closure comes in layers, and mine wasn't complete yet. A week after the party, I stopped by Natalie's apartment to retrieve the last of my things. Her place looked different, cleaner, emptier, stripped of the chaos she once hid behind drawers and cabinets. The takeout containers were gone. The evidence had been erased. Even the test results were missing from their usual place. She had replaced reality with whatever narrative she wanted to believe, again. I walked through Avafeta Fakir, Frakibads, Awanavaidiadina. Paudaradi. Quietly, noticing how each corner of her apartment felt like a stage set for a different performance. The bedroom where she had once panicked over invisible threats. The kitchen where she had lectured me about cross-contamination. The hallway where she had stored food she claimed would kill her. The silence felt heavy in a different way now, less oppressive, more revealing. When I gathered my last belongings and walked out, I felt a strange mixture of liberation and sorrow. Liberation from the weight of fabrications I had unknowingly carried. Sorrow for the version of myself who had believed so deeply, who had tried so hard to protect someone who had never truly been in danger. But the story didn't end there either. A few days later, a friend sent me screenshots. Natalie had already moved on. Her new boyfriend appeared in her posts, smiling beside her. And in every caption, she spoke about her allergies in the same grave, dramatic way she had when she first met me. The cycle had started again. New audience, new accommodations, new stage. But fate has a way of granting people exactly what they seek. If Natalie needed attention, she would always find someone willing to give it. If she needed to be fragile, she would always craft situations that supported her fragility. If she needed fear to exist in her relationships, she would always generate it. And while her new partner might walk the same path I once did, he would eventually notice the same cracks. Because lies built on fear have an expiration date. They can only survive as long as no one looks too closely. I wasn't angry at him, nor did I pity him. I simply hoped he would learn faster than I did. As for me, I realized something important. Vulnerability isn't about weakness. It isn't about theatrics or the need to be seen. Real vulnerability comes from honesty, from revealing truths even when they're uncomfortable. And Natalie had never been vulnerable. She had only been performative. The difference was everything. I began rebuilding my life without the constant weight of her imagined emergencies. I reconnected with people I'd unintentionally pushed away. I revisited restaurants I'd avoided. I lived without the looming threat of invisible dangers that had never existed. And in that freedom, I found something that had been missing for years: peace. The days following the party unfolded with a strange, muted quietness, like the low hum after a storm that has already torn through the landscape and moved on. The damage was done, the truth was exposed, and yet the world didn't crumble. Instead, it settled into a new shape, one that finally made sense. I found myself replaying the events in my mind, not in regret or guilt, but in analysis. For 2 years, I had lived inside a small universe shaped entirely by Natalie's fears. Every meal, every outing, every holiday orbiting her needs, like celestial bodies trapped in her gravity. I hadn't realized how much space she consumed until I felt the emptiness she left behind. But emptiness isn't always a void. Sometimes it's room to breathe. I began to move through my days without checking ingredient lists, without feeling tension in my shoulders every time a menu was placed in front of us, without the constant worry that something invisible and deadly might be lurking in the air. It was astonishing how quickly my body relaxed once the weight was gone. It made me wonder why I had never questioned things sooner, how fear had been enough to shape my reality. Fear is powerful when you believe it belongs to someone fragile, but fragility, I learned, can be manufactured. In the aftermath, Natalie tried to regain control. She posted carefully curated stories about feeling betrayed, about emotional harm, about being misunderstood and mistreated. She never mentioned the test results, the takeout containers, or the shrimp. She only spoke about what made her sympathetic. And for many people, sympathy is easier than truth. Her narrative spread, but it no longer affected me. I watched it unfold from a distance, detached. The power she once had over my life dissolved the moment her lies were illuminated under the harsh clarity of evidence. It struck me just how much emotional labor she had relied on, mine and everyone else's. Each fabricated allergy was a currency that bought her attention, gentleness, and control. Each supposed reaction was a way to dominate situations that would otherwise expose her insecurities. Every claim she made forced people to prioritize her, to mold themselves around her needs. Some people use kindness as a tool. Others use illness. Natalie used fear. I learned later that she had cycled through phases like this in her past. Each relationship began with intensity and ended in exhaustion. Each partner was slowly taught to treat her as fragile until they forgot she was capable of standing on her own. It was a pattern woven so deeply into her personality that breaking it would have required a level of self-reflection she simply did not possess. But patterns, once revealed, lose their power. A few weeks after the party, I met someone new, not romantically at first, but in a way that reminded me that connection didn't need to be built on crisis. She was straightforward, grounded, and honest in a way that felt refreshing after years of hypersensitivity and emotional theatrics. She asked simple questions. She laughed easily. She ate whatever she wanted without fear or apology. Being around her was like stepping out of a dim, claustrophobic room into fresh air. It took time, though, for my mind to stop anticipating emergencies. For 2 years, my body had learned to brace itself every time food appeared, every time a night out was planned, every time someone mentioned a restaurant. That kind of conditioning doesn't vanish overnight. But slowly, it unraveled. The first time I ate at a seafood restaurant again, I sat there listening to the quiet buzz of conversation, the clinking of silverware, the subtle scent of spices and salt water drifting through the air. No one panicked. No one demanded to speak to the chef. No one claimed to feel their throat tightening. It felt almost unreal. Freedom often feels like that, the calm after living too long in someone else's storm. One evening, months after the party, I received a message from Natalie's former friend, someone who had known her long before I entered the picture. She thanked me not for exposing Natalie, but for confirming what many had suspected but had been too afraid to confront. She told me that Natalie had gone through phases before, feigned conditions, exaggerated symptoms, and created chaos that kept everyone focused on her. Not out of maliciousness, but out of a deep, spiraling need to feel significant. Some people fear being ordinary more than they fear anything else. For Natalie, being seen as fragile made her feel important, necessary, impossible to ignore. Vulnerability became her identity, danger became her companion. Without them, she faded into the background, a thought she couldn't tolerate. Her friend told me Natalie was already repeating the cycle with someone new. It wasn't surprising. It wasn't shocking. It didn't even feel personal. It was simply the inevitability of a pattern unbroken. But what mattered most was what happened to me after the pattern ended. The more distance I gained, the more I understood the subtle erosion that had happened over time, how her fears had become my fears, her anxieties had become my responsibilities, her imagined dangers had shaped my behavior. The realization both hurt and healed. It hurt because I'd allowed myself to shrink. It healed because I was finally expanding again. I found myself rediscovering who I had been before Natalie, a version of myself who could make spontaneous plans, who enjoyed trying new foods, who didn't analyze every ingredient like a detective searching for hidden threats. A version who trusted my own judgment rather than someone else's fear. The mind is resilient. It knows how to rebuild. As weeks became months, the memory of Natalie's chaos faded into something distant, like a strange dream you can't fully explain upon waking. I stopped checking her social media. I stopped wondering what she would say next. I stopped caring about her narrative because it no longer involved me, and in that detachment, I found the final piece of closure. One day, while cleaning out my old files, I came across the photos I'd taken, the stack of takeout containers, the pad thai crusted with peanut sauce, the allergy test results marked negative in precise medical handwriting. For a moment, I hesitated. The images were proof of the truth. The anchors that had helped me escape the gaslighting I hadn't realized I was experiencing. But as I looked at them, I realized I didn't need them anymore. I deleted every photo. Not out of forgiveness, not out of denial, but out of the simple recognition that those images no longer held power. The truth had already done its job. My life had already shifted. Natalie's story no longer intersected with mine. Moving on is not forgetting. Moving on is choosing not to carry the weight anymore. I met with my new partner later that evening. We laughed over dinner, shared stories with ease, and enjoyed a night unburdened by fear. When dessert arrived, I didn't analyze it. I simply ate, savoring the sweetness and the simplicity of the moment. Life didn't feel heavy anymore, and that was the ultimate victory, not the reveal at the party. Not exposing Natalie's lies, not proving anything to anyone, but reclaiming the parts of myself that I had unknowingly given away. Fear controlled me once, but freedom became the final chapter. In the months that followed, I often caught myself imagining the version of my life that would have existed if I had never opened that drawer in Natalie's apartment. It was a strange and sobering thought, how a single misplaced step, a single hand reaching into the wrong space, can unravel an entire world built on illusion. Had the drawer stayed shut, I might still be living in that carefully managed bubble, still planning meals like bomb disposal operations, still rearranging my life around dangers that never existed. It's frightening how close I came to accepting that reality as permanent. Sometimes the truth arrives in silence, disguised as an accident. The realization made me more aware of how subtle control can be. Natalie never demanded obedience. She never shouted or pushed. Instead, she built a narrative of fragility so compelling that everyone around her quietly adapted themselves to her needs. It was like being trapped in a room with walls made of soft fabric, comfortable, harmless, and yet impossible to push through. Once outside that room, the air felt different, lighter, cleaner, unrestricted. I didn't rush into understanding what had happened. Healing is rarely immediate. Some days I felt angry at myself for not seeing the signs sooner. Other days I felt oddly protective of Natalie, as though her behavior had been a symptom rather than a choice. People who construct false illnesses are rarely looking for attention alone. Often, they're seeking a kind of emotional shelter, a place where vulnerability protects them from abandonment, where neediness guarantees relevance. It's a survival strategy that consumes not only the person using it, but everyone around them. The more I reflected on it, the more I realized that Natalie's lies weren't about food or allergies. They were about identity, the fear of being ordinary, the terror of being unseen, the constant need to be the center of gravity in every room she entered. Some people chase admiration, others chase sympathy. Sympathy lasts longer. In leaving that relationship behind, I didn't just escape the chaos. I escaped a version of myself shaped entirely by someone else's narrative. It was disorienting at first, like stepping outside after a long movie and needing a moment to remember that the world is real. But slowly, the colors sharpened again. I started reconnecting with friends I had unintentionally neglected during the Natalie years. Without realizing it, I had reduced my social circle to avoid the discomfort her presence created. The apologies came awkwardly, but my friends understood. Some admitted they had grown frustrated with me. Others said they had sensed something was wrong but didn't want to interfere. As I rebuilt those relationships, I realized how deeply isolation had woven itself into my daily life. Natalie had never asked me to cut anyone out. She had simply made every social gathering difficult, every meal complicated, every event exhausting. The natural response was withdrawal. The quieter my world became, the more dependent I became on her approval. That realization was perhaps the hardest to accept. Control doesn't always come from force. Sometimes it comes from inconvenience. Once I recognized that, I became more conscious of boundaries, not just with others, but with myself. I learned to ask harder questions. I learned to notice when someone's needs overshadowed my own. I learned to recognize the warning signs of emotional manipulation not through anger or malice, but through patterns that eroded autonomy over time. Healing wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. It happened in small, steady moments. The first time I cooked without checking every ingredient twice. The first time I agreed to a spontaneous dinner with friends. The first time I stopped anticipating crisis every time someone mentioned food. The quiet victories add up. One of the most unexpected challenges came in the form of guilt. Not guilt for exposing Natalie, but guilt for not recognizing my own limits sooner. I wondered how I let myself shrink around her, how I allowed her anxieties to dictate the rhythm of my life. But guilt, I learned, is only useful when it leads to insight. Beyond that, it becomes another form of self-punishment. One evening, I found myself walking past the seafood restaurant where I had once watched Natalie eat shrimp without hesitation. The memory no longer stirred anger or betrayal. Instead, it felt like watching a scene from a past life, real, but disconnected from who I had become. I went inside. The air smelled of garlic and ocean brine. People laughed over glasses of wine. A server passed by carrying a tray of oysters. For the first time, I felt entirely at ease in a place that used to hold so much tension. I ordered a meal without second-guessing it. As I ate, I realized something important. Natalie's lies had shaped my life for 2 years, but the truth was shaping my life now. The truth was quieter, gentler, and more sustainable. It didn't demand attention. It didn't pull me into crisis. It didn't make me smaller. Truth, when accepted, becomes freedom. Later that night, I met with the woman I had started seeing, not in an intense, overwhelming way, but in the steady, reassuring way that healthy connection forms. She asked about my day, and I told her about the restaurant. She smiled, and I realized how healing it was to talk to someone who didn't turn every moment into a performance. Natalie lived in drama. This new chapter lived in peace. There was a time when peace would have felt too quiet, too empty. But now, it felt like the life I had been missing, without knowing it. The last thread tying me to the past broke unexpectedly. A mutual acquaintance mentioned that Natalie had recreated the same elaborate regimen of imaginary allergies with her new partner. The same restrictions, the same claims, the same emotional theatrics. My first reaction wasn't anger or satisfaction. It was sadness. Not for myself, but for the cycle she was trapped in and for the people she would eventually pull into it. I understood now that exposing her had not healed her. It had only shifted the pattern to another set of hands. Some people aren't ready to face the truth, even when it's placed directly in front of them. But I was, and that made all the difference. As I lay in bed that night, I felt a strange sense of closure, not because Natalie had changed, but because I had. I no longer needed her to understand the harm she caused. I no longer needed validation for leaving. I no longer needed to replay the memories, searching for moments I could have altered. The story had ended. The echoes had faded. The shadow no longer reached me. I had stepped fully into a life no longer shaped by fear, control, or illusion. A life where meals were simple, outings were peaceful, and relationships were built on reality rather than fabricated fragility. Freedom doesn't always feel like a dramatic escape. Sometimes it feels like quiet normalcy. And in that normalcy, I found myself again. There is a moment after every storm when the world stands impossibly still. Not peaceful, just still, as if everything is holding its breath, waiting to see what you will do with the silence. That moment came for me months after the truth about Natalie finally surfaced. It slipped in unnoticed one ordinary morning as I stood in my kitchen making breakfast, nothing more dramatic than scrambled eggs and coffee. The simplicity of the scene hit me so hard that I had to pause. For years, breakfast had been a battlefield, ingredients dissected, cross-contamination feared. Apologies offered to restaurant staff for imagined mistakes. Whole events shaped around the fragile orbit of a person who wasn't fragile at all. And now, none of that existed. The quiet felt clean, earned, deserved. In that silence, I decided it was time to put the final pieces of the story back where they belonged. Not for Natalie, not out of anger, but for myself. Closure doesn't fall into your hands. You build it, piece by piece, until the edges stop cutting you when you touch them. I started by revisiting the places that had been warped by her lies. The Italian restaurant where my birthday had fallen apart. The grocery store I used to avoid because she claimed the air near the bakery made her throat close. The park where she once insisted someone grilling peanuts was trying to kill her. Each place felt smaller now, stripped of the illusion she had painted over it. I realized that her stories had never been about danger. They were about control disguised as vulnerability. Control so subtle you mistake it for love. Control so soft you thank it for existing. Control so constant you forget who you were without it. Walking through those places freed something in me that had been sitting still too long. The final place I returned to was the street outside the seafood restaurant, the one where I had watched her eat shrimp with casual indifference while claiming for years that it could kill her. I didn't go inside this time. I just stood there, breathing in the evening air, thinking about how strange it was that truth can hide in plain sight for so long. Sometimes you don't see the cracks until the whole thing collapses, and then the collapse becomes the beginning. Not long after that night, I got a message from one of Natalie's old friends, someone she rarely kept in contact with, mostly because friends couldn't be controlled the same way partners could. She told me Natalie had been drifting between relationships, each one ending the same way: dramatic scenes, catastrophic explanations, new lists of allergies appearing and disappearing on a whim. It wasn't schadenfreude I felt. It was clarity. People who fabricate fragility are not looking for attention. They're looking for protection, validation, an unshakable excuse to be held carefully, no matter how carelessly they treat others. But the world doesn't sustain illusions forever. Eventually, the truth comes to collect what was owed. My own life, meanwhile, began to take shape in ways that felt natural again. I learned to cook without fear. I learned to trust restaurants without interrogations. I learned to socialize without rehearsing allergy-safe plans that never mattered. Most importantly, I learned to recognize what real peace felt like. It came in the form of mornings that didn't start with complaints, afternoons without tension, dinners that were simply dinners, not negotiations. The woman I was seeing helped with that more than she knew. She never demanded reassurance. She never made crises out of ordinary inconveniences. With her, the world felt steady, not boring, not dramatic, just real. That was more healing than any apology Natalie could ever have offered. One night, as we sat together watching the city lights from her balcony, she asked me a question I hadn't expected. "Do you think she'll ever stop lying?" I thought about it. About the drawer full of forbidden foods. About the untouched medication. About the test results she hid under fast food containers. About the way she clutched her throat the moment she believed she was supposed to react and stopped the second she knew the truth. "No," I finally said. "Not until she learns she doesn't need the lie to be seen." It wasn't bitterness. It was acceptance. Natalie wasn't my story anymore. The last shift happened not with a dramatic revelation, but with something deceptively simple. I went back to that same drawer in my mind, not physically but mentally, and realized it no longer held power. The photographs I took, the evidence I gathered, the shock I felt, none of it defined me now. The drawer didn't expose her. It freed me. I used to think closure required answers. Now I know it requires understanding. Understanding that some people build storms because quiet terrifies them. Understanding that healing doesn't mean erasing the past, but refusing to live inside it. Understanding that leaving isn't the end of the story. Growing is. It took a long time, but I finally stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. Natalie stole a lot of moments, but she didn't steal my future. And in the end, that is the truest form of reclaiming your life. I rebuilt myself not through confrontation, not through revenge, but through choosing honesty in a world full of comfortable illusions. And as strange as it sounds, I'm grateful. Not for the lies, not for the chaos, but for the fact that leaving taught me how to recognize real love, real peace, and real truth when they finally appeared. Some stories end with flames. Mine ended with clarity. Quiet, steady, lasting clarity, and that was enough. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to TaleHub for more deep, immersive narratives. Thank you so much for listening. Your support means everything.